And so in the second class period, there were 12 students, down from 40. You try to push people just a little beyond the boundaries to which they're accustomed, and they completely freak out. But the dozen students who hung around went into juvie hall, and they would go in for 2 hours, and we would walk out, and we would sit down on a bench right outside the juvenile detention facility, and we had a questionnaire. We would say to the student who was in there for the first time, we'd say, "So what did you think?" And they'd hem and haw for a bit, and then they'd finally say something. It almost always was just like this. In some form or another, they'd say, with respect to those 16-year-old Hispanic girls who had a completely different set of life experiences from them, the upper middle class white student would say, "They're just like me." Holy cow! I'd long thought that learning empathy was the most important thing. That empathy is the most important thing we could learn, and I had no idea how to teach it. I mean, how do you teach empathy? You beat somebody until morale improves? I mean, how do you teach somebody to put themselves into another person's shoes? I never figured out how to do that. But these kids were learning empathy, which is astonishing. So that was working swimmingly, so of course I had to give that up, and went to New Mexico and created a homestead a little over 7 years ago that is the absolute apex of durability. So solar panels and solar pumps and an off-grid house, and it's a well-insulated straw bale house with passive solar heating and the whole thing. And it's just an amazing example of how to live outside of industrial civilization. And I thought, listen, I'm a teacher and a white man, and so everybody's going to follow my lead. Everybody is going to recognize that industrial civilization is insane, and they're going to walk away from it and live out in the wilderness like me, in my little mud hut. That didn't quite go as planned. Apparently, us white men don't have it all figured out. Light comes on, and not everybody's listening to us as if we know everything. Another light comes on. This is weird. So not everybody followed, and that's just as well. I was hoping everybody would walk away from industrial civilization, but I now realize that there's no escape. If sufficient numbers of us walk away from industrial civilization and industrial civilization all falls down, then 440-some nuclear power plants around the world melt down catastrophically. That's going to be inconvenient, considering that Fukushima alone represents a significant threat to human habitat in the northern hemisphere. And really, it's just getting started. And that's just 3 reactors. So, there's no escape. I grew up in occupied Nez Perce. I now live in the occupied Mimbres. 990 years ago, the Mimbres people discovered civilization. They discovered maize. Or maybe a better way to put it is maize discovered them. And within 5 years, they were in human population overshoot at the local level. And in year 17, it was really dry. And the drought persisted into year 18 and 19, and they ate the seed corn. In year 20, 970 years ago this year, Mimbres culture collapsed, and a few survivors walked away. A few survivors walked away, and when they came back to the region I now occupy, they didn't do corn, they didn't do maize, they didn't do grains ever again. And they persisted another few hundred years until, the white people showed up and solved that whole problem for them. So now I live in occupied Mimbres, where the last free-flowing river in the state comes out of the first designated wilderness in the world. Another thing that insults me, there are so many. Wilderness? What a concept. We created the first wilderness area with the Wilderness Act in 1964. Can you imagine what indigenous people think about wilderness? Oh, you have to designate an area. That's quaint. We call that home. Aldo Leopold in 1909 was a forest ranger in the southwestern United States in the area then known as the New Mexico Territory and Arizona Territory. They weren't states yet. And he was working for a new organization, the United States Forest Service. And he did a survey of this two-state region, which is enormous. And in 1909, he realized that there were 6 areas of 500,000 acres or larger without evidence of civilization. No towns, no roads. 1909, that's pretty early in the game, and there were only 6 in this enormous area. And so he launched a lifelong campaign 10 years later to save some of those. Because by 10 years later, there was only 1 of those areas left. There were 6 in 1909. Almost everybody was still riding horses. There were relatively few cars. And yet within 10 years, the number of areas that were 500,000 acres or larger, about 200,000 hectares or larger, uninterrupted by humans, had gone from 6 to 1. And so he spent the rest of his life trying to convince people that we should save that 1. And the Wilderness Act was passed in 1964, 16 years after his death. And it created the Gila Wilderness as the first designated wilderness in the world, and currently the largest one in the lower 48 states. So it's an area the size of Connecticut and Rhode Island combined. It's a large area. And so it's wonderful to live there, but I think every day about the concept of wilderness and the concept of Indians and how interlinked they are. The insults continue. So it's pretty clear at this point that we can't walk away from industrial civilization, and at least not en masse, because when the system tips over, it takes all those nuclear power plants with it. It requires at least 20 years to decommission any one of those nuclear power plants. When asked recently about Indian Point, the nuclear power plant outside of New York City, a well-populated area, obviously, in the United States, the recent ex-head of the Nuclear Regulatory Commission of the United States, when asked how long it would take to decommission Indian Point, 1 nuclear power plant, he said 60 years, maybe 50. Depends on how much money we have. And of course, nobody's trying to do that. Nobody's decommissioning any nuclear power plants. We commission new ones every year. We don't decommission them. 60 years. Indian Point is currently operating without a license. Its license expired. So it's not even licensed to operate. But it just keeps going, unregulated. The Fukushima of the future, times several hundred. So we can't walk away, and obviously we can't stay within industrial civilization. It's completely unsustainable. We can't sustain the unsustainable indefinitely, and look what it's doing. It's driving 150 to 200 species a day to extinction. It's fouling the air and dirtying the water. It's washing the world's soils into the oceans. It's forcing us apparently into human population overshoot at the rate of more than 200,000 people a day added to the planet. That's births minus deaths. So the horrors of industrial civilization continue. 5 million people die early deaths every year because of climate change. 2 billion people, probably more, go hungry every day. And we think it's awesome because we're in this position of relative privilege. We can't walk away, or we cause the extinction of all humans. We can't keep going, or we cause the extinction of all humans because of climate change. Damned if you do and damned if you don't. If that's the case, I suggest we do. We do something. We do almost anything beyond the mainstream. We're like fish in a river. The fish don't know there's water. We don't know there's culture. But we're immersed in it. We're embedded within this culture, and we don't ask questions of that culture. I'm inspired by the example of Socrates to ask questions, and this is how I spent the last 10 years or so of my life in the classroom, was just asking questions. I would show up with a question. I do this still when I show up on college campuses, and I'm asked to speak to a classroom. Occasionally I have them read something in advance. They almost never do. I was a student once, I remember. And then I just ask a question or two, that's all. Sometimes I have it written down, but usually I don't, and then I forget. So I walk in and I forgot the question I was going to ask. And so then it's all ad-lib. And it makes the students unbelievably uncomfortable because, you know, they show up with their notebooks and their pencils, and they want to write down every word so they can regurgitate it next week on the quiz. And I show up and I ask them a question. I ask them, so this is a course in global development. What does that mean? What is global development? And they look at me like I'm insane, because it's the third week of class. I'm supposed to know this. And so they regurgitate the answer they heard 2 weeks ago. And I say, global development, so you mean we want to take this set of living arrangements everywhere? We want to develop the world. So we want to take these lesser developed countries, what we call third world countries, and make them to look just like this. And they say, yeah. Why is that? Because this is awesome. Because we need to free those poor indigenous people. And around it goes. I'm never asked back to the same classroom. It's weird. So we can't walk away, and obviously as a society we can't keep it going because we're driving ourselves to extinction. In fact, I would argue we're already there. I think we're just walking around to save on funeral expenses at this point. I think as an entire species we're already dead. People ask me where they should move to. Where should I go? Where should I go? Where should I move? I get this question all the time. The most popular question I get after I speak is, what can we do? And the second most popular question is, where should we move? And I'm going to answer both of those. What can we do? Well, we can be human beings instead of human doings. Well, we're particularly good at wanting to do something. Let's just be. And so I encourage people to set aside their smartphone and go out and sit by a creek or a river or a coastline or in a forest and just sit there and just be a human being, just be a person for a few hours. And people our age, for the most part in this room, they can handle that, but for the 20-something set and younger, it's ludicrous to set aside your digital device for 2 hours. I'm like itching thinking about it. And just go out there and be a person and experience the natural world and immerse yourselves in it. And it's so different from this culture that we think is sane and that we think we should carry to everywhere. Everywhere in the world should be just like this. And so that's one thing we can do, is to be. To just be a human being. And let the natural world wash over us. And almost always what that does is it causes people to realize this great loneliness, this thing that's within us that we don't matter. You know, that in the end that we're just nothing. We're a speck on a speck on a speck, that we just don't even matter, and that this whole thing, there's no purpose, and there's just nothing. Well, no wonder people want to play on their phones all the time. If there's nothing, there's no meaning beyond what we give our lives, then that means I'm not really important. I need to text somebody right away. So that's hard. And so I encourage people to let that loneliness wash over you. Let that feeling of being alone, of being unimportant in the grand scheme of things, just wash over you. And deal with the fact that it's a horrible, lonely, indifferent universe. The universe doesn't care about us as a species, much less about us as individuals. The universe is amoral. It doesn't have moral. It doesn't care. It doesn't care about me, and it doesn't care about you. So what do we have? We have this. We have you and me. We have this human connection. We have our relation to the outside world, which we treat as resources. We treat nature as our resource, and each species out there as resources for us. And they're our relations. They're not our resources. You remember, some of us remember back in the day when large institutions, corporations, nonprofits, universities, whatever. Everybody had a Department of Human Relations or a personnel department, as if people are, you know, persons. And now those things don't exist. Now we have departments of human resources, because we've converted the entire world into a set of resources for us to maintain this. And now we've transformed humans into resources. We're all cogs in the grand machine. And we didn't even know that transition occurred, and people just, no, okay, I'm a resource now, I'm not a person. It's so bizarre when viewed through my obviously bizarre lens. Maybe it's just me. So, if we're nothing, if we're all going to die, as I pointed out last night, that is, we all get to die, where do we find meaning? Where do we find hope? Meaning is within each of us. We have to assign our meanings to our lives. It can't come from the outside. There's no purpose beyond what we give our lives. And if you can't find a reason for being, a purpose for your own life, then I don't think you need to look to a book or to a 12-step plan. I think you need to look inside. And that's what I tell people when they ask me where I should go. Where should I go? The second question, the one I forgot about a long time ago. I got to rambling along. You probably did too. What can I do? You can just be. Where can I go? You can go inside. You can go into your heart. You can figure out what it means to be a human being. You can figure out what it means to be a human at this most amazing time in history. A time when the entire system is crumbling. Industrial civilization is going away in the not too distant future. And so is our species. So ponder that. If that doesn't give you enough to think about, then you probably should go back to your smartphone and text your friends. What does it mean? What does it mean to be a human? What rises up in you when you realize that the world of the future is not going to be like the world of the past? That the world that we all grew up in is going away. There will be some profound changes in the not very distant future, and they will affect each of us. What does that mean? What does that cause to well up in you in terms of your humanity? What does it mean to be a human to you? How do you spend your time if you know your days are short? And by the way, if you live to be 120, your days are short. That's nothing. It's at the end of your life, even if you live to be 100 or 120 or 150, you're going to remember a few moments. You're going to remember 3 minutes in a row of what I said here this afternoon. You're going to remember 3 minutes in a row of your whole life. You're going to remember those moments, and hopefully they're moments of joy and happiness and satisfaction that you experience. So let's try to create those. In recognizing that there's more than one way to live in the world, that there are in fact 7.1 billion and 7.1 billion and counting numbers of ways to live in the world. We need to find our own way. And we need to find a way that resonates with who we are and where we are in history. Where we are at this time. What does it mean to be surrounded by people and immersed within this culture? I don't know what it means for you. For me, it means doing the same ridiculous things I've been doing all along, which is asking those questions that got Socrates killed. I'm not asking the exact same questions, but I'm using the same approach. I'm asking questions of this culture. What does it mean to be the fish in the river and to not even know there's an ocean, much less a land base? What does it mean to be surrounded by a set of living arrangements that we just take for granted, but that isn't the only way to live, and in fact is unusual to the point of being weird? 2.5 million years of the human experience, and nobody had a light bulb. And now we reach for the switch, and if light doesn't come on, we think there's something wrong with the system. There's something wrong with the system, all right. And it has something to do with the light bulb. That's all the hints I'm going to give about that. Where's the source of my hope? I get that a lot. I don't have any. I agree with Nietzsche on this one. Hope in reality is the worst of evils, for it extends the torments of man. And were he not such a misogynist, he might have included women in there too. Yes, hope is wishing for an outcome over which we have no agency. Hope is wishful thinking. By definition, check it out. Check with your good buddies Merriam and Webster and see what they have to say about hope. Hope and fear are the twin sides of the trying to predict the future, but we can't do it coin. We hope for a better outcome, but that's wishful thinking. We fear certain outcomes, but without taking action, neither of those is relevant. Neither hope nor fear matters. Action, as Edward Abbey pointed out, is the antidote to despair. And action is how we get from point A to point B. It's not through hope, it's not through wishful thinking. It's by taking action. Will it matter? Only to those of us taking the action. Maybe to a few other people. Will it matter in the grand scheme of things? Well, of course not. We all get to die. All species get to go extinct. So, of course, in the grand scheme of things, you know, even if it doesn't happen now as a result of climate change or catastrophic meltdown of the world's nuclear facilities, even if it doesn't happen in the near future, you know, the sun's going to expand and blow up, and then we're all going to run out of space to live. So we were never guaranteed